Hello, welcome back to Janus Academy. This is the ongoing course on the general introduction to history of art, or just general history of art. 52 or possibly 53 lectures, we still have not decided. This is the seventh one in our series of lectures, and this one takes us roughly 50,000 years in the past from present moment. We're talking about cave of Altamira. And we are talking about something entirely novel. Up until this moment, we were discussing statuettes made either of organic or inorganic matter. Now we're talking about a cave drawing or a cave painting, if you prefer. This is a completely different thing. Now, while these cave paintings, cave drawings that we're going to discuss go back 15,000 years into the past, we need to say that this is not really the beginning of cave drawing or cave painting. We need to say that we are discovering these as we go, as we speak, really. The whole idea is that cave drawings go way back further and further into the past. And recently we've been making new discoveries, I mean, recently or not that long ago, that take us back much further into the past. So we've discovered some cave drawings that go back 30 or 35,000 years in the past. 35,000, yes. We have some recent discoveries that would suggest going all the way to 50 or even 60,000 years into the past, meaning that these are of course Paleolithic, Upper Paleolithic, and that these are much older than the current moment that we've chosen. Now, the cave of Altamira in itself was occupied in different periods before this one. The drawing that we're going to be discussing is going to be of Magdalenian polychrome bison, but there were many different instances in which this particular cave was occupied. One of them was previously 18,000 years ago. They range back, they go back, well, much further than that. The earliest paintings here were applied around 36,000 years ago. So you can just see how big the scope is here. Now, we've decided to take this particular one and to focus on that one, although this cavern is filled with many other paintings. It's really a complex of drawings and images. We've decided to focus on one of them, but we're going to mention the others as well. This is, of course, something that has to do with chronology. The choice was made following the chronology. Now, since we started this entire course, we've said that one of the guidelines is going to be a seminal work, a great introduction to Western art by Jensen. And we said that he starts investigating cave paintings. So for him, this is really the beginning of art, or something that we can call art. Of course, we can still not really talk about art. It's way too early to apply that term, or at least not how the Greeks have coined it and then how we've adopted it ever since. But he begins with this. Now, in one of the previous lectures, I said that he begins roughly 15,000 years in the past. I need to expand upon this. He basically begins by saying that these particular drawings and some of the drawings that he mentions go back 30,000 years, but then he takes it back to 50,000 years. So it's a bit of a fluid thing here. Now, we've chosen this because 15,000 years ago is a very important period. This is the this is the period where we have already started domesticating certain animals. We have started domesticating dogs, for example, and this changes our entire relationship with nature. It changes our entire relationship with animals as such. And this, of course, is incredibly important, not just because we have the Lowenmensch figurine that we talked about previously, but also because, well, it's mostly the animals that are represented in these cave paintings. And this is kind of a trope, really. This happens in most cave paintings that are scattered all over the place. We could say that we have these two things that constantly appear and reappear. One of them are, well, representations of animals. And the other one is basically representation of hands, like hand stencils in a way, that were obviously applied by the painter applying their hand, the palm of their hand on the stone, and then blowing paint all over it. So then it would be a negative image of the sort. So we have these hands pretty much all over the place. Now, when I said that we have these two different types, what I meant was that we have, well, this like handprint of the sorts, and then we have depictions of animals. But we also need to say that, I guess, a subdivision of this is a series of images where we have something that we today interpret as a shamanistic ritual of theriomorphic entities that are basically in between animals and humans. And we assume, as we interpret this today, that this is a shamanistic ritual where a disguised shaman is symbolically turning into an animal. Now, this is really important, and we're probably going to spend this entire lecture talking about this particular phenomenon and what it really means, and why are animals so incredibly important, and why we talk about them in such great detail. We've covered the chronology roughly, so we're saying that the one drawing that we're going to be discussing takes us back 15,000 years, but it's a much broader chronology, and it's a much broader time scale that takes us back tens of thousands of years in the past. And it's an interesting thing to compare these with the fetishes that we were talking about. Now, what is so interesting about this? Well, first of all, fetishes that we were talking about, figurines, statues, they are easily portable, and these are not. These are static. It's a really big difference if you think about it, because the figurine that's like this big or this big, well, that you can carry that pretty easily anywhere you go. But if you make a cave painting or a cave drawing, that is static. You're not going to be able to carry that cave anywhere you go. So right off the bat, we have this situation that our art, or whatever we choose to call, to label as such our activity, if you will, is growing more and more sedentary. Now, you could say that people still being nomadic at this particular time, they sometimes visit and revisit these caves. People sometimes in their nomadic existence have cyclical patterns of movement. So they would go to a certain part of the planet, they would spend their time there until they exhaust local resources, then they would move, but then eventually they would come back. This happened, and we can see in this particular cave, the cave of Altamira, that as we mentioned already, it was occupied in different periods of time. So it would be occupied, let's say, 18,000 years ago. It's a completely different time scale. So it would be occupied 18,000 years ago. Then there would be roughly 2,000 years where only the wild beasts would occupy it, and then humans would come back in 16th and 15,000 years ago. And these things happened on occasion. This is really when we're talking about how we chose this particular image. And why are we talking about the bison in this particular cave? Well, it has a lot to do with the importance of the bison and its similarity to the bull. Now, this particular animal, to my knowledge, has been extinct ever since. However, if you look at it visually, I mean, you look at the image that is on the screen, and you can see just how similar a bison is to a bull. Now, a bull is one of the most important animals that we are ever going to talk about. And it's going to be a part of an entire lecture series that we're going to have, and I'm very excited to be engaged in creating it. And that's going to be dedicated to sacred animals. It's also going to be 52 or possibly a bit more lectures, 1-hour lectures, so like a 4-semester kind of a thing. And we're going to be talking about many different animals that were considered sacred, either domestic or wild. The point is that if we talk about these animals that were instrumental in development of humanity as it is, there's very, very few animals that are more important than the bull. You could argue that dogs are incredibly important, cats to a certain extent, but I don't think anything can measure really to a bull. I mean, it's kind of a region-specific thing that you can say the jaguar is extremely important for the part of the world that we today call Latin America and, Mesoamerica. And you could say that, yes, there's certain importance to be given to the lion, both in Africa and then in parts of Europe where lions existed back in the day. But I don't think there was an animal that was so important to us, both wild and domesticated, that we domesticated for a very specific reason, and that we've connected ourselves to in such a deep, profoundly important manner. And yeah, so I'm not going to take away a lot of it talking about the bull because there's so much to be said, and we don't want to take away from this particular lecture. But yes, this was an important aspect and an important quality for us to choose in when we were thinking about which particular image we want to represent and which particular image we want to talk about when it comes to cave drawings. In this regard, we may be mentioning some other ones, but the most important thing about is its connection with the bull. Now, if you're talking about the bull, then of course that takes you to Picasso, because he was fascinated with the bull. This was his whole thing. He saw himself as the bull, he saw himself as the minotaur. And yes, this is like a symbolically incredibly important animal, not just when it comes to development of humanity, but also when it comes to, well, artistic inspiration that goes well into the 20th century. Of course, there's the whole Spanish corrida, there's that whole thing. There's this association that we have with the bull. We think of it as a very powerful animal, which it is. And we think about something that was, I would say, one of the first images of Godfather that we connected with the animal world, that we wanted, well, I wasn't going to say to be adopted by the bulls, but we wanted to take their characteristics and make them our own. We admired bulls, and I guess we still do to this day, for their strength, for their power, for their ferociousness, for their virility. All these aspects are really, really important to us to this day. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a bull in person. This is a legitimate question, because I think the first time I saw a bull in person was when I was 24 years old. And I think I saw a bull in person perhaps 2 more times after that. I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps it was just one. Quite a rare sight to behold. Now, you can see a lot of cows all over the place. If you travel around France, you will just see a lot of cows, but not a lot of bulls. And when you come to see one, you understand why, because they're just magnificent, majestic, and frightening animals. They're really, I mean, you don't really feel comfortable imagining yourself around one of those. And then you can think about how our ancestors reacted to those. You can think about the whole interaction that they had, especially if they were going to hunt a wild version of this animal or something that was very similar in appearance and in behavior to this animal. And of course, this is just the thing. Now, to go back to Picasso and his fascination with bulls for all the aforementioned reasons, Picasso is not only important for this bull analogy, but he is also important to us as an artist, famous idiosyncratic artist that defined the 20th century in more than one ways. And his statement that all of human art, all of human endeavor, everything we've done is really was not really enough to surpass what was achieved by cave paintings. This is a really interesting statement, and one of those very rare moments where I personally tend to agree with Picasso. Because, yeah, a lot of disagreements there. But 2 major agreements is that Picasso valued, on one end, the Orthodox icon above all the other things. And you can research this on your own if you're interested. He thought that Orthodox icons were amazing, but purely aesthetically speaking, not even to get into the whole like spiritual and divine and meaningful thing. Just look at pure aesthetics. So he found them amazing on that level, and then he found the cave art to be the same. Now, it's completely pointless to compare the two. I mean, they're so different. If we're talking about aesthetics, though they do share some other similarities, we may go back to it by the end of this lecture. The point that Picasso was trying to make is that we've never produced anything better than cave paintings. And of course, he was saying this as someone who not only was a famous artist during his own lifetime, well accomplished artist, extremely successful during his own lifetime, but also as someone who was incredibly resilient and ambitious and who never really gave up. He painted and drew and sculpted and did all these things basically until the day he died. He basically worked until he could work no more. And if you think about, well, many different things about this particular person, work ethic is is something that he had in spades. Meaning that he was never truly satisfied with what he's achieved, and he always wanted more. Now, if you have such a person who is incredibly ambitious, who is never at ease, who has never arrived at their destination, so to speak, who always try to perfect what they do, and are ready to, well, spend their entire life, very long life at that, painting and working 12, 16 hours a day, then you take it from that particular point of view and you say, okay, so this guy has spent his entire life thinking about visual arts. That's all he's ever done. That's all he's ever cared about. And he thinks that this particular way of expressing yourself, or this particular kind of art, again, shouldn't really call it art, but we're going to keep making this mistake throughout the lectures, throughout this particular lecture, he thought that this was unmatched and unsurpassed. Now, this merits an inquiry, and this merits to be positioned into the proper context, I would say, of early and mid 20th century, especially if we're talking about what made Picasso so famous to begin with, which is Cubism. Especially if we talk about how Cubism came to be and what made it so important, what made it so popular in a certain extent. And what was the world of art like in this particular period? I think all of these things will help us to understand cave drawings and how they were made and why they were made, and what did the artists of this particular period see in them. Why were they so fascinated by them? Of course, this is not just Picasso. I'm just taking him as the most obvious example. Why were we so enthralled by these things? Well, the first thing you can say about these cave paintings is that they were made in a very peculiar way. They're polychrome. So that means that they have more than one color. And if you think about how they were created technically, the running assumption is that we've basically applied a mixture of animal fat and pigment, most likely coming a mineral in source, and so we would basically ground the pigment into dust, and then we would apply fat on the cave wall, and we would blow pigment into that fat. So this is what made it stick to stone. Part of it was drawing, obviously, and part of it was, well, applying color in this particular fashion. This is technically, well, rather ingenious if you think about it, especially if you think about the fact that a lot of these have survived to this day. I mean, when I do visits of the Orsay Museum or of the Louvre Museum, one of the things I tend to talk about, I mean, if I'm so inclined that particular day, is the technique and how well do you make a painting and how long can a painting last. This is a pretty big deal. Now, you go to the Orsay Museum and you see a lot of the Impressionist paintings, and you see that, purely technically speaking, they're not that well made. They're not meant to last. They were never meant to last. They were meant to be quickly consumed. And you can see that there's a big level of difference, I mean, purely technically speaking, in how well those paintings were made as compared to, let's say, neoclassical paintings that were done roughly at the same time. Not to start comparing them to Renaissance paintings or, God forbid, the medieval paintings, which is another analogy that we can make between Orthodox icons and cave paintings. The idea is that if you look at an icon and how it's made, the Byzantine icon, for example, or you look at the Western medieval paintings, let's say from the 13th century, there's just no comparison in quality. I mean, the medieval ones are way better made, purely technically speaking. I'm not talking about aesthetic judgment here, though I would say that they're better made even in that regard, but that's kind of besides the point. I'm just talking about technique. I'm talking about when you make a painting, how long can that painting last before disappearing, before crumbling to dust, if you will. And you can do this very easy experiment. You go to the Louvre Museum and you see some 13th century paintings that have no protection whatsoever. They're just exhibited out in the open. You can breathe into them. I mean, you shouldn't, but you get my point. Whereas where you go to the Orsay Museum and you see these paintings that were made in the late 19th and early 20th century, they all have glasses over them. No, not a single one, or very, very rarely would you see one that actually stands out in the open. They need this protection because otherwise they would be damaged. They are not made to last. Now, all of this to say that you think about these, cave drawings and cave paintings that were made 15,000 years ago, and they're still around and they still stand. I mean, how crazy is this? Like, compare, talking about medieval painting, and you say, oh, this is done in great quality 700 years or 800 years later, and it still stands, it's still in good quality. What is 800 years as compared to 15,000 years? I mean, that's not even comparable. And then you think about that we have these cave paintings, again, that go back 30,000 years in the past, 35, 40,000 years in the past. I mean, these are crazy amounts of time. Just think about how well do you need to make anything. I mean, literally anything, a statue or, I don't know, any other object that we use, and make it last that long. I mean, what can you make that can last 15,000 years? Well, we have an answer: cave paintings. Yeah, and a lot of these fetishes, obviously. But I would argue that it's more impressive to do a painting or a drawing that is going to last that long than a statue made of stone, because technique is obviously very different. Now, this is amazing, just the longevity of these. Truly, it's mind-blowing, and I don't think that today we have the capacity to do that. I really don't. I mean, someone can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I don't think if we wanted to replicate them and if we wanted to make them be as long-lasting as they are, I literally don't think we could do that. Now, a similar thing can be said about how well these are made. And this is an incredibly important part of this entire lecture, because in the previous centuries, we were talking about certain limitations that were present either due to technology that was available, the stone tools that we've had, either through the developmental stage of humanity. Again, to go back really quickly to the first lecture and talk about Makapansgat's pebble, and we're talking about something that comes before the Homo genus. I mean, we are not talking about full humanity quite yet. If you go back that far into the past, 3 million years ago, you're not really talking about fully developed humans yet. You're talking about Australopithecines, so that's a really different thing. But we are talking about certain level of technological and, I would say, intellectual, as clumsy of a term that is, stage of development. And we're always talking, I mean, we spent 6 lectures talking about limitations and how we thought these people were limited one way or the other. Now we get to the point where we say, well, these cave paintings are done so incredibly well that they actually go above to what we are able to do now. And if you look at a lot of research done at these cave paintings, people who've studied them and art historians, and they tend to say the same thing. I mean, these are amazingly well done. Not only in terms of longevity and technique, but in terms of quality of drawing, in terms of stylization, in how realistic they are, in how dynamic they are, in all of these things that make a drawing or a painting good, on all of these aesthetic judgments that we can have purely technically speaking. Imagine yourself being, let's say, an art teacher, not art history, but art teacher. So you're trying to teach people how to draw and how to paint. Really, I don't think there's a better example of dynamic drawing that brings things to life, that, screams a presence and the substance, but that is another thing. We're going to come back to that later, as much as these do. And really, they betray an incredibly keen eye, a very sharp perception, eye for detail, eye for motion, understanding of space, and a lot of talent. I mean, this is the moment where we can start talking about these people being seriously gifted, the ones that made these. It's like, these are amazingly well done. And you can say these things like, even if you're looking at, again, medieval drawings, like, for example, you look at stained glass windows of Notre Dame. I've dealt with Notre Dame a lot, Notre Dame in Paris. And you can say, okay, these stained glass windows, they're obviously made in a different era. They mostly go back to the 13th century. And although this is, full Gothic style, a lot of these windows are done, stylistically speaking, that's more like Romanesque than Gothic, at least when it comes to drawings. And you say, okay, this is a rudimentary style, but my God, is it well done. Like, the quality of drawing is just amazing. And you can say that, yes, some of these stylizations are funny, like the way they depict, lions or camels or horses. It's like, okay, it's funny, but incredibly well done. And you can say the same thing here, but without the funny part. These are just incredibly well done, and I cannot, overstate this. We are getting to the point where I think why Jensen decided to include this as the beginning of art, because we are no longer talking about limitations. We are no longer talking about speculated chronology. You could say that the first three entries really in our series of lectures are contested and are not confirmed, and we don't really know if it was fully done this way or not. This is a lot of assumptions. So there are a lot of limitations in this regard. But when it comes to cave paintings, we're like, okay, this is amazingly well done. And everything else placed aside, the way that people lived, the way they moved, whatever their habits were, whatever their rituals were, all the speculations on account of their notions of the sacred, and all of these things aside, you can, talk about all of this, and we will, but the main thing remains that these are well-made paintings, drawings as well. I keep kind of going back between the two. I'm not entirely sure how to understand them myself. I guess they're both, but, we'll get to talk about the difference between a painting and a drawing. It's a considerable difference, but yeah, I kind of think they're both at the same time. I don't know. In any case, you can understand why someone like Picasso and, many other people were fascinated by these, because not only that they were basically the entire essence of art in a nutshell, condensed into one particular presence, but they were also kind of a pointer and kind of a benchmark in a way, and an idea towards which we need to move, again, as artists. Not to say as humanity in general, which makes perfect sense if you think about their actual sacred nature, their sacred character, how we use them and why we use them, to which end. Therefore, you can really understand why Picasso was fascinated by them. But again, all of those things aside, I think you could argue that he was fascinated by them purely technically speaking. Like he was fascinated, let's say, by Matisse, his great rival, like he was fascinated by Douanier Rousseau, like the extent of imagination and the extent of pure talent. Not sure you could say this about Rousseau, but that's a completely different thing. And this is something that we want to address. Now, not only that is it important how these were made, blowing powder onto the walls, but also how they were observed. This is a very important thing. Incredibly so, even, because they were observed in a very peculiar manner. They were incredibly cinematic, in a way. Yet another reason for 20th century artists to be enthralled by them. They were looked basically with the torch. You wouldn't just get to this drawing and observe it like you do with the painting in a museum nowadays. You would sway a torch in front of it, so they would become animated. It's really important. And they would basically be like a little film that's taking place before your eyes that lasts a very short period of time. Well, the amount of time it takes you to sway a torch in front of. But that impression, that early cinematic impression, this idea that you want dynamic art, not static art, this changes everything. And this is what makes it so fascinating. Now, why is this so important when we're talking about the 20th century, especially about Picasso and the whole context of Cubism? Well, one of the ways to understand the whole, appearance of Cubism, really, is that it was, for a lot of it, a reaction to cinema. Now, you could say that Impressionism before that was a reaction to the camera, to photography, and we're going to be talking about that when we get to that particular chapter. Cubism, on the other hand, was a reaction to cinema, moving images. Painters ask themselves, what are we to do now? I mean, we have moving images, so how are we to rival this? Painting is a static medium. And the way for them to, rival that, to counter that in a way, was to make paintings that would be observable from all of the angles at the same time, to deconstruct the painting in a way. And the whole idea of Cubism, therefore, was to create dynamic representations that would be able to rival dynamic images of the cinema. And they went to an extensive effort of doing that, deconstructing what they saw into geometric shapes, into cubes. Hence the whole name of the movement. Now, you could say that their idea was that they needed to make their art more dynamic. And if we're talking about, well, not just paintings really, but statues, I would argue mostly statues, you could say that since Greeks came around with their art, especially after archaic period of Greek art, they wanted art to be dynamic. They wanted their statues to be dynamic. That's the whole idea of contrapposto. You break the monumentality, you break the rigidity present in Egyptian statue, and you infuse the statue with dynamism, with life. You go back to this notion that life is movement, that it's a spiritual thing. Really, you say anima in Latin means soul, but it also means breath, and breath is animating. So if something moves, it's alive. And we have this very Christian idea that spirit is really the most mobile thing. Spirit that is represented symbolically in light, divine light that gives life to everything. This is a scientific fact, not even a religious assumption, but the fact that we are alive thanks to the sun. And that scientifically speaking, the greatest speed that we are aware of is the speed of light. So light not only gives us life, but it's also the fastest thing around. Now, the idea being that if there's motion, there's life. That light is life, you get the point. So if we want our images to communicate the notion of the sacred, if we want our images to communicate divine presence and, spiritual presence, we want them to move. Very simple. And this is why we have stained glass windows in churches and cathedrals. And this is why we have torches swayed in front of these cave paintings, because we want them to move. Because motion is life, it's a spiritual presence. And these particular drawings are, chock full of spirit. And this is another reason why we admired them so much in the 20th century, because we lived, and still do really to that point, we live in a world that is, industrialized, that is mechanized, that is very removed from spirit. Now, you could say that this is, largely thanks to the Industrial Revolution. And we'll talk about it extensively once we get to the late 19th and the early 20th century. But it also has a lot to do with the Cartesian school of thought, with Descartes' philosophy that was so inspirational for, the period of enlightenment that will come after it. And that the whole idea, one of the ideas of Cartesian school of thought that was heavily criticized, especially in the Eastern optics, was that it was separating man with a capital M from humanity and from spirit, that it was something that was increasingly atheistic, although Descartes was a Catholic himself, but something that really laid the foundation for atheism, like this whole idea that you want to separate everything that's spiritual out of a human individual as well as the entire society, and you want to focus solely on reason. So it's very reductionist in this regard. And this is something that people suffered from in the 19th, 20th, and the 21st century. And therefore, they sought examples of things done differently. They sought examples that were alive with spirit, that were not, removed from spirit. They sought examples of fully fleshed out depictions and scenes and situations, fully lived experiences. This is the whole Nietzschean thing, that the human existence is all about the fully lived experience and whatnot. So the idea was that they would find all of this and way more than they wanted for in these cave paintings, because truly they were immensely spiritual. And that's another thing to understand, that they take us back to the time where we were, chock full of spirit. But not only we were, us, like humans, but also the world around us was. Everything was brimming with spirit. And this is the case, with most of the old world, most of the, I would argue, medieval world, and most of the pre-modern world. Really, but something that begins with the Renaissance, and it's not an accident that, Descartes is instrumental in all of this, is this whole idea of rational pseudo-scientific, I would say, but scientific, let's put it in the Western perspective, worldview that was foreign to, well, spirit, that was very dry and systematic, and that sought, as Max Weber said, to basically kill all that is spiritual under the premise that it's superstition, it's the inferior worldview, it deals with magic, it deals with all these, well, lower forms of existence and lower forms of thought. But yeah, a lot was lost with this. You could argue that baby was thrown out with dirty water. I would say that water was not dirty to begin with, but that's a whole other thing. The point is that we are looking at these cave paintings, and we're looking at them not being amazingly well done, but being amazingly spiritual too. Of course, in very distinctly pre-Christian terms. Now, there's a very important thing to address here, and this is, well, their technical skill that is in certain ways unparalleled and unmatched. And then we talk about another occurrence in history where we have technical skill and spiritual presence that is unparalleled and unmatched. And I'm talking, of course, about Orthodox Byzantine icon, both things that were admired by Picasso, go figure. We're talking about this idea that we've reached a certain full potential, or something that looks like it from this point of view, at a certain point in history. And then, well, thousands of years have passed, and then we reached it again at a certain other point in history, 14,000 years later. And we are, well, away from those two now. We are moving towards a very different period. Now, why is this such an important thing to address here when we're talking about cave paintings, of all things? It's to counter and basically run against, in a way, this particular worldview and view of history of art, or general history, really, that is linear, where we have this whole idea that we keep advancing, that we move to better things, that every next period, every next era is better than the previous. And I think it's, well, very obvious that this is not the case. Now, you could do this in two different ways, really. You could say that a lot of art historians in the 19th century optics that hasn't been really challenged that much, not as nearly as much as it should have been, argue that, let's say, we've reached the pinnacle of, well, aesthetics, reached the pinnacle of beauty in the classical period of Greece. So this is 5th century BCE, so 2,600 years ago. And that everything ever since has been a very slow decadence. I, of course, disagree with this, but it doesn't really matter. This would also be a linear worldview to a certain extent. You could say, like Hegel, this is his worldview, that is not linear, but basically presents us with a triangle, sort of. Well, we have this slow rise of, spirit and matter and how they clash at the first symbolic stage of development. Then they come to be fully harmonious in the classical, and then they descend again to romantic. So his idea would be like this. So we go up and then we go down. If you assume that, well, cave paintings were amazing and then that the Greek art was also amazing, then I guess you would assume the slow decadence trajectory. But I think that it's rather cyclical, and I don't think that although I have the entire course dedicated to historical analogies that is very much cyclically structured, I don't think that we have this whole idea of, yes, we've reached the zenith and everything is on a downward slope ever since. I think that these things happen for whichever reason, but yeah, it's not a straight linear trajectory. That's what I'm trying to say here. Now, in this particular regard, I want to go back to how we saw this and as perfect at the beginning of the 20th century. I think we still do. We've addressed the technical side, the fact that this was really incredibly well made. But I also want to address the spiritual side, the substance of these paintings, which is so incredibly important because, as we already mentioned, they are intensely spiritual. They take us to this whole idea that any artist, well, is supposed to be striving for or is striving for. The notion of a message and whatever signifies that message are supposed to be perfectly harmonious. The idea of how you want to communicate a certain message, if you want to communicate it, but then the absence of message is also a message, and how you're going to go about it. Now, I can take an example from Impressionism that I think is really good. You can have a painter like Manet, who is all about the message and who is all about politics and meaning and all of it. And he, I would say, well, I wouldn't say disregards the style. I mean, he's very aware, very conscientious of his style. But let's say that he privileges message and meaning of his work as to pure aesthetics. On the other end, you have someone like Monet who privileges aesthetics and who openly states, my paintings don't mean anything. They're just images. Enjoy them as such. And then on the other end, you have Renoir, who brings the two together, who's like, okay, I want both the meaning and I want both the visuals. Like, they have to come together. These particular paintings and or drawings, cave drawings, are in this regard perfect mixture of both. They are a very good representation of a very important message, sacred message. And this is, well, one of the chief reasons why we chose this particular representation that we're talking about, the bison, that looks a lot like the bull, to be, well, the one that we're going to be talking about, because it's a sacred animal for all things. And it's very deeply rooted in the general context of shamanism. This idea that animals are divine, not just that they're sacred, but that they're literally divine, they're gods. Or if you want to put it differently, that gods communicate their messages to us through animals. And that shamans, when they do their shamanic thing, they become animals, which takes us back to what we initially mentioned, that shamanistic ritual, for most of it, is the shaman becoming an animal, which is why they use animal hides, they use horns, they use all these things to literally, physically, ritualistically turn themselves into animals. And this, of course, has a lot to do with what was also previously mentioned, this whole idea of connection between meaning, beauty, and aggression, violence, and the sense of danger. Because a lot of these animals are, well, very dangerous. I mean, again, if you find yourself next to a bull, you come to understand it's something that's communicated 100 meters away. You understand that these are dangerous animals, not to be messed with. Though we constantly mess with them, of course. That's the whole idea of corrida. The substance of these is very, very clear. Their dynamic nature, their spiritual nature. And the idea is this, that we are looking at divine creatures communicating divine messages. Now, we're going to take another example from extremely anachronous context, which is, again, Greek myth that I like going back to, although it has nothing to do with this particular chronology, nor even the worldview, nor even really geographical location. And this is the idea that we have certain deities like Hermes that are messenger gods. Now, it's an interesting example because Hermes is a messenger god whose one of his tasks is to communicate divine will to humans. But he's not just a messenger, he's a god himself. Now, you could say the same thing about Nike, the goddess of victory. She communicates the message to humans, but she's a god herself, a goddess. And this is the way I look at animals in shamanism, that they communicate divine messages, but they are divinities themselves. And that when we're looking at these depictions, we can say that a lot of them take us to the notion of hunting. A lot of them take us to this idea of conflict that we have with our gods. Now, why conflict? Well, because we want to be like gods. How do we achieve this? In many cases, we eat our gods. And again, as strange as this may sound, we just need to go back to, well, Christianity being a dominant world religion, just in terms of sheer numbers, not to talk about anything else. But yeah, we eat our God in Christianity. I mean, this is what the Eucharist is all about. It's about the flesh of God, bread being the flesh, and wine being blood. So quite literally, we eat our gods. And this is not something that the Christians have come up with. This was really a lot to do with the whole animal sacrifice, as it was present with the Greeks and with many other civilizations. When you eat, let's say, a cow, I mean, you're thinking about the fact that Hera, the main goddess of the Greeks, was represented as a cow. This was her, well, I wouldn't say totem animal, spirit animal, let's put it that way. But yeah, that she often appeared as a cow. And when she is described by Homer, for example, her beauty is described as a cow. She is described as having cow-like eyes. So, I guess Greeks thought that cows had beautiful eyes, not to get into all of that. But the whole idea is that we are looking at animals as our betters, not only as our ancestors, which is an important thing, but also as our superiors. And this then takes us back to, Aristotle, again, when he is discussing tragedy, and he is discussing how we should be looking at actors that are better than we are. So they can't be too much better than we are, because we would then not be able to identify with them and we would not be able to empathize with them, but they have to be better to a certain extent. And if you think about this, again, extremely anachronous example, then we are looking at divinities that are close enough to us so that we can want to have their characteristics. We can want to hunt them and to eat their flesh and assume their power and assume their characteristics. But they're better than we are, because in many cases you look at, divinities as simply being better than you are. This is arguably so with Greeks, because again, their gods are terrible, just terrible entities, beings, but they're better in terms of stronger. They are immortal. They are, incredibly powerful beings. So they're better in that way, not to speak of their non-existent morality. And this is, again, what was so fascinating to people in the 19th and 20th and 21st century when it came to cave paintings, is that they felt divinity in them. They felt strong substance, incredibly strong presence, especially if you were to witness them using a torch, as it was originally intended to. Now, there is another thing to be said about the location of these drawings and paintings that has a lot to do with how caves were being used. Now, we have to say that caves are not terribly comfortable places to live, and that the people who lived in this particular period did not use them that often, really. They moved around a lot, and they would not spend that much time in caves for many different reasons, but let's say that they were more dangerous than they needed to be. And when you went to a cave, there was, specific reason to do so. However, when people did inhabit them, and we have ample evidence of people did spend time in caves, they would use them in a compartmentalized manner, meaning that all of the living would be done closer to the exit or to the entrance. And then the further you went in, the less available the part of the cavern was, the more you would have art on display. And this is a very interesting thing, because if we think about the shamanistic ritual of what the shamans were doing, they would fall into a trance in most cases. They would have these ritualistic, ecstatic, often out-of-body experiences that would be either induced by, certain drugs, or through prolonged periods of hunger, or to prolonged, extreme physical effort. And the point I'm trying to make here is that entering a cave to reach galleries where these drawings were on display was often a very dangerous affair, because you had to crawl through caves. You had to go into the belly of the mountain in some instances. It was not reachable at all, and it was quite dangerous, and I would argue very scary in itself. Which again takes us closer to this whole idea of beauty and danger coming together, the whole idea of the sacred being very different than the Christian idea of straight, holy, good God that is only good. No, we have, the notion of divinity here that is, dangerous, like these wild beasts were. And even wanting to see these paintings was dangerous to a certain extent. Crawling to reach these passages was a dangerous affair. You wouldn't necessarily know entering a cavern if it was already occupied by a wild beast. So that was a chance you would take. And we know that wild beasts did occupy this particular cave that we're talking about, the one of Altamira. meaning that there's this infused sense of danger that has to do with the sense of sacred, and then that has to do with the sense of awe. Now, when we were talking about Lovenmensch figurine, we said that what made it so interesting, amongst other things, was the fact that it took so long to be created with, well, limited resources and limited time. You could say that this is also the case in a slightly different manner when we're talking about cave art, because reaching these spaces to paint was quite perilous. And then reaching them so that you could enjoy them, so that you could observe them, was quite perilous. And we have, well, I wouldn't say ample evidence, but enough very well substantiated hypotheses that these were the integral part of the shamanic experience, that these were the messages that were communicated to us in shamanic trances, and that this is really what these cave paintings are. So we may have the time to talk about it in greater detail, but this is the running, I think, assumption that we're going to take now, is that this is what makes them so sacred, and this is why they resonate with mechanical, industrial, spiritualized world of the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. Something was recognized here. And what was recognized was the instrumental aspect of the shamanistic ritual. That when we are looking at these cave paintings, we are looking at shamanistic visions that are communicated to us. And then we say that, yes, these were incredibly important to the people that made them. And they were important because they were difficult to make, because so much skill was invested, so much talent, so much hard work. Just getting to these places was dangerous. And you have all of the, how should I say, elements, not only of shamanistic ecstatical trance, but also the very Christian notion of a pilgrimage. You know, the whole idea of a pilgrimage is that you exert your body, you go through extensive physical effort so that you could have a spiritual experience, a spiritual cleansing of the sort. Pilgrimages really only work if you exert yourself. You can't go to a pilgrimage by taking a plane. It doesn't really work that way. If you want to do it right, you have to go on foot. And in most cases, you would have to go through very inhospitable terrain if you want your pilgrimage to be, well, a rewarding experience. I guess if you want to do St. James Road, the Camino de Santiago, or Saint-Jacques, as the French people call it, it's kind of besides the point if you do it by a car. You know, you're not really profiting out of it. You're not really having the proper experience. And you could say the same thing about these caves. If you want to really enjoy these paintings, drawings, if you really want to experience them properly, well, you have to crawl into a cave and hope to God that some wild beast is not waiting for you there to bite your head off. I mean, as simple as that. You have to hope that the cavern doesn't collapse that given moment and you're buried under, well, dozens of tons of rubble. These were all very, viable options. You have to hope that the rain doesn't fall suddenly and then just floods the entire cavern, and yeah, you drown. So again, very viable option, something to be considered. Suggesting that if you want to deal with these in one way or the other, you have to go through a certain risk and you have to go through a certain danger. And this makes these even more exciting, and it makes them even more important because there's so much risk and because there's so much danger involved. Now, this also takes us back to hunting. The assumption of Mircea Eliade in his History of Religious Ideas, that hunting is the original notion of the sacred. A lot of these, cave drawings depict hunt one way or the other. A lot of them depict wounded animals, animals in this transitional stage that in itself can be analyzed in regards to shamanistic ecstatic visions, that we are talking about the notion of the sacred, as was previously mentioned, as a transitional state, something that brings life and death together, and something that brings us closer to this prey, like this whole idea that we not only eat our God, but that we also kill our God. Now, again, just think of Christianity, not that weird of a notion. Because the Christians, believe that indeed we have, when I say we, I mean we as humanity, as a community, we have killed our God. That's kind of the main premise of the whole thing. And this tells us about this importance of death within shamanism, this importance of transitional stage between life and death, and how that is where the sacred is. And again, if you think about the danger of reaching these caverns, reaching these, well, distant and inaccessible drawings and paintings, it all comes together. It creates a very coherent, situation, to put it this way. Now, you could say that if you're talking about history of art, I would say very generally speaking, literature and poetry included, if we want to just look at all of the arts together in cinema and just put everything in, you could say that we have these three topics that are profiled as the most important. You could say the topic of love, death, and time is really what occupies most of our imagination. Now, if you go back to this Freudian premise, and we often do, that love and death, eros and thanatos, are one and the same thing, just two aspects of one and the same force. And if you say that these exist in time, because we exist in time, Heidegger had a lot to say about that, how we exist in time, you could say that these three kind of blend into one. And that if we're looking at these, cave paintings, that they tell us this one thing. They tell us how we are dealing with danger, how they are dealing with divinity, how we are dealing with transitory states. And I would argue that entering a cave is really a transitory affair to begin with. And a cave is a transitory space. And again, we have to kind of remind ourselves that caves are our earliest temples. Now, our time is running out here, so I hope I will have enough time to just quickly address a comparison between a cave that is both a temple of the sorts, I mean, a very rudimentary idea of a temple, or a sacred space, let's put it that way, it makes more sense, and an abode, a dwelling. If you think about temple complexes in Egypt and in Babylon and all over the old world, they would be akin to cities, like really small cities, meaning that it's a sacred space, true and true, where you also live. And this is something that Mircea Eliade writes a lot about, how entering a city is always entering a secluded sacred space, that everything inside a city is sacred in one way, and then exiting the city, going back to nature, this great dichotomy of nature versus society, you're leaving the confines of the sacred space. You could be looking at a cave the exact same way, and I think, well, not only that you could, I think also you should, having in mind that a lot of the temples in Egypt, for example, have this gradual nature, that you enter a temple and you have most profane, most open spaces by the entrance, and then the further you go inside, the more sacred it becomes. You could say that's a similar thing in a Christian church. Again, you have the main nave, and then you have the Holy of Holies behind the altar. It's the same thing with the Judaic temple, the first and the second temple. So it's this idea of gradual approach to what is sacred. The cave is the early example of that. You would have the abode by the entrance, and then the further you go inside, well, the more interesting it becomes. The more dangerous it becomes as well. And now this is our time. Again, as is usually the case, we didn't really have enough opportunity to cover and develop everything as we could. But I think, we'll just have to stay with this. The next item for our consideration is going to be Young Ghazal, figure from Jordan. And this is going to be a drastically different affair, because now we're talking about something that comes from agricultural time, Neolithic agricultural time. We're moving from Paleolithic to Neolithic. This is a major jump, a major shift, and we'll get to address it. For the moment, I thank you for your attention, and I hope to see you again soon. Ciao.